This morning, I'm joined by Bishop Philip North, the Bishop of Burnley in the Diocese of Blackburn. Philip, thank you so much for being part of our Perspectives on the Church conversation.
It's really good to be with you. Thank you for having me. Thanks, Lindsay.
Thank you. And as you know, we're working through this programme called Shaping for Mission. Yeah. And I wonder if you can tell us from your point of view, what do you think is the biggest challenge the Church is facing at the moment?
Oh, I think the biggest challenge the Church is facing is the evangelistic context, which I think is about as hard as it can be. You know, I think we live in a nation which, for whatever reason, has kind of lost its sense of the transcendent, has forgotten the Christian story, has lost its connection with the spiritual. And, you know, we can diagnose forever why that might be. You know, lots of people blame science or our failure to address some of the big questions about God and suffering and so on. What's interesting is this secularization seems to be so much about Western Europe. And if you look to many other parts of the world, we're part of a church that is growing faster than ever before. You know, there's major renewal of Christian life going on in different parts of the world. But here in Western Europe, we're in this bubble where it's really hard to capture imaginations with the gospel. And I think a lot of Christians blame themselves for that. And a lot of churches feel very run down, as if they're kind of personally responsible for you know, a century and a half of decline. And I think we often, you know, rush to simplistic answers, as if, you know, the right technique or the right form of words will somehow reverse all of this. But I think we need to be really honest that this is such a tough context. And, you know, I'm in dumbstruck awe of the faithfulness of Christians around the country who are keeping on praying and loving God and serving their communities and keeping the show on the road in these tough times. I think, you know, people in this country, they've kind of lost their sense of who God is. Their interests are elsewhere. But it can be really hard for us to find the ways in, the language, to re-engage imaginations with the gospel.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting way of framing it, because it's something about the Christian imagination rather than just the kind of, you know, telling the story or, you know, making sure that we've got people who've been to church and then they know what it's all about. But actually, there's another level, isn't there, of engaging with the life and with the narrative that we share.
That's right, because we're not just asking people to kind of bolt on to existing lifestyles, a bit of church going. You know, what we're calling for is conversion. You know, the Christian invitation is come and die with us in the end, isn't it? Come and live your life in a wholly different way, which is about, you know, incorporation into the life of a church. It's about generosity with every gift that God has given you. It's about putting God right at the center of your life. You know, it's a huge, huge challenge that we're setting before people, and a whole new sort of life with Christ abiding in them that we're asking for people. So, you know, that's big, isn't it? And it's difficult to get people from their existing lifestyles to that kind of change.
Absolutely, it is. And it sounds like a bit of a mixed sort of invitation, doesn't it, in many ways? I mean, we know the joy of living life with Christ, but, you know, sort of saying, come and die with us, come and totally turn your life around. It's pretty overwhelming sort of invitation we've got, isn't it, in a way?
And it is a life of joy, but it's not a life of simplistic joy. It's not the life of joy that you get from going on a beach holiday to Ibiza or sinking a few pints in a pub. It's the joy that comes from new life in Jesus Christ. It's the joy that comes from repentance and conversion and walking the Christian journey. And it takes time, you know, to form that in people. It takes time to communicate that. I sometimes think we're very hard on ourselves as a church, actually.
So that's a really kind of clear way of looking at the challenge we face. Do you think there are any opportunities in that for us as churches?
I think, you know, of course there's opportunities. There's opportunities because there's a million Anglicans who are all very, very committed, but there's opportunities because we've got a network of church buildings and we've got church schools. We've got so many inroads into our community. We've got such a, you know, still got a very strong presence. But I think actually in terms of addressing the core issue, we've also got huge resource in our tradition. I think there's a bit of a tendency to want to say, these are new times, we need to start from scratch, we need to kind of innovate and do things in totally new, bold ways, outside the box thinking, etc., etc. Whereas actually, the church has been in this kind of situation again and again and again of facing acute and intense evangelistic challenges. And I think we need to learn from that. And I think we can learn two things from that, if you don't mind me talking for a bit. Stop me if I get boring.
No, please.
The first is renewal has always come when small groups of people have been really, really serious and mutually accountable about their own continuing conversion into Christ. If you look at the early church, in the Acts of the Apostles, those early communities were really serious about knowing Jesus and offering their whole lives to him, and formed communities in which they were mutually accountable. It's interesting how many times renewal in church life has gone alongside renewal in the monastic life. You look at the Desert Fathers or the Franciscan renewal of the 12th century. In these occasions, people have really been serious about their own conversion. You can apply the same to the Oxford movement in the 19th century, or to Methodism, or to certain aspects of the revivals we see in the Reformation and in the Counter-Reformation. It's been people who've been really serious about what it means to follow Jesus Christ and have offered their whole lives to him. And it seems to me that, one thing we need to do is just go deeper in our faith and go deeper into Jesus Christ and commit ourselves ever more deeply to him. The first response is ever deeper conversion. And that's about making our parishes really deep communities of prayer, where people are really committed to one another, to their worship, to the life of prayer, and where the Christian life is lived in ways which are hospitable and generous and vivid and sacrificial. If each parish could be seriously good news for its community, because in each community we have a place of people really committed to prayer and really committed to service, then actually people really start to take note. So I think, the first bit we learn from looking back in renewal is this seriousness about our own ongoing conversion to Christ and just going deeper in the journey with Jesus Christ. But I think the other thing that has always characterized renewal is a really serious bias to the poor. So again, if you look at the Acts of the Apostles, what was noticeable, what made people sit up and think about those early Christian communities, was the way they cared for the poor and for the widows, the way they erased some of the distinctions between slave and free, and formed equal communities in which the needy were served. A renewal movement that fascinates me is that of St Vincent de Paul, the French school in the 17th century in France, which had such a huge impact in this country through the Oxford movement. And that was all about Jesus, the evangelizer of the poor. Jesus, who in Luke chapter 4 says, "I come to proclaim good news to the poor." And people sit up and they take notice of Christians when we're doing exactly that, when we're putting the gospel into practice, through really being serious about where we locate our ministry and placing it on the margins. Beginning of Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, Jesus stands up in the synagogue in Nazareth and he quotes Isaiah 61. "I've come to proclaim good news to the poor." Now, if you track through and look at Isaiah 61, it goes on to say, "For it is they who will rebuild the ruined cities. It is they who will repair the shattered walls." Still talking about the poor. So I'm absolutely convinced that when renewal comes in this country, as one day it will, it'll come from the edges, it'll come from the margins, it'll come from the poor and the forgotten and from the least likely places. And that's why, as a church looks to the future, the biggest disaster would be continuing withdrawal from outer estates and inner city areas. That is going to be so tempting to do in dioceses worried about money. Simply, we could very easily become a financially viable, complacent middle-class church. The trouble is that would not be the Church of Jesus Christ, because Jesus constantly locates himself on the edges. Why does he do that? Because that's where life and renewal and freshness comes from. So I think those are as we use that resource, which is our tradition, I think we see those two things, deeper conversion to Christ, deeper commitment to the poor.
Thank you. That's a pretty compelling vision for the Christian life and for the life of a parish church that you've just shared with us. What might you say to somebody who says, "I like that, that feels right, that's where I'd like to be and where we would need to head towards, but it doesn't yet sound much like my parish church, it doesn't yet sound much like the community I'm part of." What's the first step towards moving in that direction?
I think, I'm sort of, when I was a parish priest, one thing we did in that parish was to develop a rule of life for the parish. And we drew what was initially quite a small group of people wanting to live to that rule. And they weren't smug or arrogant, they didn't particularly meet separately or form a clique. They were just people who wanted to go deeper with Jesus Christ through prayer, through study, through commitment to the Eucharist, through generosity and through service. And over time, that group grew. And it was lovely to see that parish come together and really kind of form and grow in the Christian life. And as it did so, it became better and better news for its community. So I think it's about small groups of people who want to go deeper with Christ, just doing that and setting an example for others. So that's one thing, I think. I think the other thing is that, every church can be good news for the poor. Every church. It doesn't matter where you're located. You could be serving the poshest part of the whole of the Diocese of Lichfield imaginable. You can still be good news for the poor. And you can do that in a variety of ways. You can do that through who you're praying for. You can do that through twinning with a parish in a more challenged area, perhaps on an estate. You can do that by seeking out where there's people who are struggling in your own community and meeting their needs. You can do that actually through using voice to challenge unjust structures of power. Because quite a lot of what churches do around service of the poor can actually be accidentally colluding with injustice. So in richer areas where people perhaps have a bigger voice or can be better organised, looking at some of those justice issues can, globally as well as locally, can be a really, really good plan. Why is it that 600,000 people in the world's largest economy are dependent on food banks today? Looking at some of those deeper questions is something that can be done. So any church can ask itself that question: how can we join in with the work of Jesus in being good news for the poor?
Great, thank you. And my final question, Bishop Philip, is about what gives you hope for the church?
Oh, Jesus Christ. That's the point, isn't it, really? If I were a kind of spreadsheet bureaucrat of some sort, and I looked at the church as it was now, I'd think, oh, how depressing. All their buildings are crumbling. They've had 1.5% decline for 100 years. I'd be saying, look at the demographic of the congregations. And you can work yourself up into a frenzy. And I think so many churches do get anxious. And I think a lot of our evangelism can be stress evangelism, where it's motivated by the desire to prop up an institution and keep the show on the road and keep the pensions plans ticking over, etc. Well, actually, the gospel is a gospel of joy. Let's focus on Jesus Christ and the joy that he brings. And let's be passionate about sharing that joy with others. And even the smallest church can be a community of joy. And if it's a community of joy, then people will find that incredibly attractive. So let's forget the doom narratives and the people speaking gloom over our church. And let's focus on Jesus Christ and the joy we find in him, because he's our hope, he's our good news. And if we fix our eyes on him, we'll be able to build communities of joy in every part of this country. And then people will come running.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. Love to talk to you.